Oh, no. There we go. Good evening, good folks, and welcome to this special joint meeting of the City Commission and the City Planning Commission on this fine Monday, June 10th of 2024. May we have roll call, please?
Commissioner Cochin,
Here.
Vice Mayor St. Clair,
Here.
Mayor Johnson,
Here.
Commissioner Kilgo,
Here.
Commissioner Keener,
Here.
Commissioner German, absent, Commissioner Gorman,
Here.
Garwin, Leroy, Ms. A, Montgomery Keys, Blake.
Excellent. Thank you. So first up on our new business, we have housing needs and solutions being presented by our planning department. And we got Planner Pesh joining us. Well, if you please introduce yourself.
Jamie Pesh. I am a Planner 3 with our planning department here. Everything is set up here. This is a similar presentation as the one that was given at our last Planning Commission meeting. We are talking today about zoning reform impact on Muskegon's housing shortage. So, as many of you know, we have a housing gap in our community for 5 years, 2022 to 2027. We need nearly 300 new housing units to keep pace with demand. 3,000.
3,000.
Sorry. We have 786 vacant buildable residential lots within our city's single-family zoning districts, and we are also working on limited market rate apartment units, which are currently being planned or being constructed. This is the 2,924 housing units that are needed across a range of price points, both for sale and for rent product. This is taken directly from the housing needs assessment that everybody is fairly familiar with at this point. So today we are focusing mainly on our city's single-family residential zones. This accounts for about 38% of the city's total land area, which is the largest of any of our land uses. And it's also the reason we're focusing on it. This breakdown today does not really include any of the available land that's outside of the single-family zoning districts. So multiple family zoning, form-based code districts, we're not talking about those today. Strictly single-family zones. As some of you know, there are 3 single-family zoning districts, R1, R2, and R3. And the primary difference between them is the minimum lot sizes. So you can see highlighted in the chart there, the minimum lot area and the minimum lot widths are the things that differentiate between these 3 zoning districts. R1 takes up the most land, in part because it has the largest lot sizes. R2 and R3 are smaller and take up smaller amounts of land. So, as I mentioned, there are 786 vacant, buildable, residentially zoned lots in the city. 204 of those are owned by the city of Muskegon, 40 are owned by the Muskegon County Land Bank, and the remainder, 542, or about 70% of those, are owned privately. So we talk about our housing needs. We can look to these single-family zoning districts and the vacant land that is contained within them as potential sites for new homes. Many would think that in a single-family zoning district, 1 lot equals 1 house. That's not always the case, but in the scenario that we were to build out that way, we would have 786 new single-family houses. Because of the 3 different lot sizes required in the R1, R2, and R3 zones, we can build more than 1 house per lot. So under our current zoning, with lot splits in place, we could build just over 1,100 new single-family houses. This is getting us closer to the stated need with the lot splits, but we certainly have a long way to go. So today we're here to recommend various changes to our zoning ordinance that will help us get closer to the needed housing units in our current single-family residential zones, and essentially looking at ways to maximize the number of units that we can have on existing land. The city only has a finite amount of land, so we have to be very strategic in the way that we accommodate the needs of today and plan going into the future. So we are coming to you with 4 different recommendations. Obviously, none of these are going to be decided upon today. This is just a precursor to follow-up meetings, public engagement sessions, and ultimately recommendations for zoning ordinance amendments. The first being reducing the minimum lot size requirements. We'll go into detail in each of these. Increasing housing choice in our neighborhoods, allowing single-family houses to add units, and reducing or eliminating parking minimums. Here, I'm going to let Mike Franzak take over. He will talk through some of the recommendations and we'll go back and forth.
Good evening, Mike Franzak, Planning Director. Our first recommendation would be to amend the R1 districts to match the current area and bulk requirements of the R3 districts and eliminate the R and 3 districts. Back in 2015, we only had one residential single-family district, which was R1. And at the time, you needed at least 50 foot of road frontage and 6,000 square foot to be considered a buildable lot. However, that did not really match the reality of the city. Many of our lots were built, especially in either downtown neighborhoods, on 30-foot wide lots. So at that time, we had considered reducing that to 30 feet. I don't know if we had the support at the time. This was all fairly new. So what we had decided to do was to match the blocks a little bit closer to how they were actually built out block by block. But what we could simply do is go back to the R1 zoning where we don't have R2 and R3 and simply make it so that you only need 3,000 square foot total and 30 foot of road frontage. And we can see on the paper up here that how that would look in the zoning ordinance. Everything else would essentially remain the same other than the minimum lot size and the width. And we can see that block by block, we have some differences, but when you look in any residential area, they're already pretty much near each other anyways. Even looking in the individual R1s, you can see some that look like an R2. In the R2s, you can see some that look like an R1. So they're already mixed, block by block as well. So it really wouldn't be that noticeable. And from a block by block standpoint, you wouldn't notice much of a difference. Here's an example of two 50 feet wide lots, and there's a 120 foot vacant lot to the left. You can see certainly it's a parking lot currently, but it's zoned for residential. So under this scenario, we only have the potential for 2 lots to the left houses. But under this proposal, we would actually have the ability to do 4 lots. And a good example of that here on the left are 2 50-foot wide lots with some 33-foot wide lots to the left. Would be the same type of scenario, and they seem to blend in very well with the surrounding houses. Here's another scenario we would see with the current lots. We could have, there's 3 lots here, and we could potentially split it, the 127-foot wide lot, to have a 4th lot. If we went to the R1 zoning, we would have potential for, so this would go from 3 to 4. But if we made this amendment, we could actually get 6 lots out of this, and this would be represented here.
So under that scenario, changing all existing minimum lot sizes to our R3 standards, we would get about halfway to our stated goal. It would certainly yield additional single-family housing units, but we would still have quite a ways to go. Our second recommendation, I don't know if you want to come back up and do go back and forth a little bit here.
So the second recommendation would to be amend R1 districts to allow up to 4 units, enabling greater housing choice everywhere. Currently, the R districts only allow for single family. It's the most restrictive of all of the zoning designations, only allowing for 1 type of housing unit. In the past, we've tried to address this through form-based code, but that's not really the only option that we have. We could simply use our current Euclidean type of zoning ordinance that says that there was only 1 type of house. We could allow duplexes, we could allow triplexes up to quadplexes, and we could even put restrictions similar to the form-based code where you have to meet that minimum lot size. So if we were going to allow a duplex, it would have to be on a 40-foot wide lot. Or if you were going to have a quadplex, it'd have to be on a 50-foot wide lot and have an alley. These are things that we could replicate without actually having to rezone it to form-based code. So we can see our current zoning ordinance on top that only allows for one family detached dwellings and multiple families under certain conditions, and those are ones that have already existed, and if there's room to expand, we have allowed that. That was a change we made back before 2015 when we had some of the larger downtown homes that were just having a hard time being fixed up with that much space. And below we can see in green what the ordinance could look like. We could allow for duplexes, provided that there's at least 40 foot of lot width, or triplexes and quadplexes with at least 50 feet of wide lot width, and ADUs, as long as it's not the primary structure. And there's also other limitations we could put on an ordinance like this, however the commission sees fit.
So taking into account this scenario, specifically the one that Mike described with duplexes on a minimum 40-foot wide lots, if we were to build out entirely in duplexes, we'd be much closer to the stated goal, only 443 units short. This assumes many different things, that everybody would build a duplex on every lot of a minimum size, and it's really an idealized scenario, just demonstrating what would be possible and the additional capacity that is out there on our land currently with tweaks to our zoning ordinance. We have a third recommendation.
Third recommendation would be to allow single-family houses in form-based code districts to add units. This was a point of contention when we were expanding the form-based code early on around 2015 and 2016. There were a lot of people in the neighborhoods, especially Nelson at the time, that had been turned off by duplexes and triplexes and quadplexes in their neighborhoods because when we were first allowing these houses to be carved up into additional units, there was not many zoning regulations. So we ended up with overcrowding. We ended up with too many units, too many parking spaces in the front, too many garbage toters, not enough space for everybody. And we think we've kind of addressed that with our form-based code to help alleviate some of those worries with the minimum lot requirements for duplexes and such. So we can replicate those outside of the form-based code and our design standards throughout the regular ordinance. So these just talk about some of the different standards that are required into the form-based code, design requirements. And that's something that we heard from some of the planning commissioners at our presentation. We presented this this last month at the planning commission. They said they do want these to fit into the neighborhood. They don't want them to stick out. So these are some of the design requirements that are required in the form-based code. This also talks about the requirements about not changing a single-family home into a duplex. And some of that reasoning is because a lot of these single-family homes don't meet the requirement that you would see in a duplex, so they're kind of grandfathered in for that type. So we could fix this with a simple zoning ordinance amendment, which would clearly state that existing single-family homes could be converted into a duplex or more units, as long as they have the size requirements and they meet the design requirements. Recommendation 4 would be to reduce or eliminate residential parking minimums. I think Jamie, you want this one in there? Sure.
So this is one of the lesser thought about topics, I think, overall. We talk a lot about building new housing, but we don't talk about some of the requirements that come along with constructing new housing based on our current zoning requirements. So currently, every new housing unit in the city of Muskegon requires 2 off-street parking spaces. That's 2 spaces per residential unit. This is an arbitrary number. This was doubled in 2002 from the former requirement, which called for 1 parking space per dwelling unit. This has a lot of implications, one of which being the amount of space taken up by parking versus housing. A new single-family house without alley access requires a minimum paved parking area that's nearly 2/3 the area of the minimum unit size that could be built. You would also have additional pavement that comes in the form of your driveway approach where it crosses the sidewalk and such. And in multifamily zones, really only a quarter of our existing developments meet our current parking minimums. This is a chart specific to multifamily, and I know we said we were talking strictly about single family, but this really makes the point clear that developments are only building as much parking as we're requiring. There are only 4 multifamily housing developments in the city that have more than our current 2 parking space per unit ratio. Everything else is at or below that number. We've heard from various developers that they don't need to build up to 2. We've heard 1.5 for some. Financing requirements for some of our low-income housing tax credit housing mandates that they have 1. Just because we don't have a minimum parking requirement doesn't mean that the parking will not get built. It just means that the developer or the home builder will be able to decide exactly how much parking they need on site rather than being told what they need on site. So again, returning to our build out scenarios, this breaks down the various recommendations that we had. You can see our current single family capacity, as I mentioned with lot splits, would be about 1,100, and it goes up from there with the recommendations presented today. We would still be about 450 units short with all of these recommendations, but again, these are idealized scenarios. Things will not play out in the way that we're presenting. These are just illustrative and really meant to show the capacity that's out there with the current vacant lots that we have in our single family zones. I want to return again to this chart too. This is a huge factor in what gets built. The city and the land bank combined only control about 30% of the vacant lots in our single family zones. The remaining 70% are privately owned, and the private owners can do what they want with them. If they're willing to build new housing on them, that's great. That would help us achieve our goal. But all of the scenarios presented today are assuming that all of the vacant lots out there are potential redevelopment sites and that all of the owners of those vacant lots are willing to build on those. We know that's not always the case. So again, this is really meant to explain how far we can get, but also how far we have to go. We do have efforts other than zoning reform that are happening. Obviously, we have a continued focus on LIHTC projects, including buildings like Berkshire, 1021 Jefferson, the Samaritas building, and a few coming online soon, Amity and Allen Commons, and Lofts on Muskegon. Market rate and multiple family housing, where it is permitted by our current zoning regulations, we continue to focus on that, and that has brought projects such as the Lakeview Lofts, the Leonard, and Western Place row houses. So again, this is just a recap of the recommendations today. As we said at the start of the presentation, there are going to be no decisions made today, but the process looks generally like what you would see for any other zoning ordinance amendments. But in this case, we are planning to first go to the Neighborhood Associations of Muskegon meeting to discuss this and hold public input sessions in the future, and that's in conjunction with our community engagement department. Those would take place throughout the summer. Today, we're really looking for feedback from both commissions on the recommendations that are most worthwhile to pursue at this time. Staff can go in any direction that you would prefer, but we're really looking for feedback on that. And then ultimately, this would come before the Planning Commission for a zoning ordinance amendment, whatever ones are decided upon, and then to the City Commission for final review and approval of that. Jake Ekholm will give us a few examples in other parts of this country that have gone through similar processes. We're not alone in this struggle to increase our number of housing units, and these 2 cities show that.
Good evening, everybody. Nice to see you all in one place. So briefly, first of all, thank you to the planning team. They did a really nice job, pulled together exactly what we asked, just saying, how do we find ways to increase the potential capacity to meet our housing gap, because we knew we didn't have enough available land to kind of build outward. So we have to understand, how do we, make density an option while also fitting in with the character of the neighborhoods as they exist today. But so I want to go over a couple case studies and then kind of talk about next steps and how this relates to our larger housing policy framework that we're going to be proposing to you this calendar year in multiple steps in presentations and policy recommendations similar to this one. So case study one was effectively exactly what we're proposing here. And this was in a smaller community in Maine. And so they, same as us, did a 5-year housing needs assessment, which found that they had a substantial housing gap due to industrial and large agricultural growth, forestry growth, that was creating a lot of demand in their region. They amended, and they have a very large municipality in Maine. It's a little bit different than how we work, but they amended zoning of over 1,600 acres in their town limits, and they allowed for small multifamily, and then up to triplexes. They eliminated their parking minimums, and they also allowed a minimum lot width as low as 24 feet for duplexes. This increased their capacity per acre to 16 housing units from 9, so nearly doubled their capacity per acre for livable housing units. You can actually see over the course of years, once this gets implemented, there's a COVID blip in there, and then you just see a pretty substantial increase in the actual number of housing permits issued because they removed administrative barriers in their zoning ordinance and other city ordinances to allow for more housing choice. So that was a success story in a smaller community, and we'll touch on the largest community that people typically reference when speaking about housing choice and zoning reform and density reform, which is Minneapolis, Minnesota. So Minneapolis is well known, Minneapolis, St. Paul, but especially the city proper of Minneapolis, as really getting ahead of this before it became a dire issue like it is in our community and so many other communities. One of the most crucial results that they really wanted to tackle is that they saw pre-housing crisis, national housing crisis, that their rental rates were really elevating at an unsustainable level, which was causing displacement and really serious social issues in their community. So they took a look at zoning reform, and they noticed that through zoning reform, including duplex, triplex, quads, and ADUs as accessory dwelling units as a use by right in all of their residential zones, and eliminating parking minimums and a reduction in the minimum lot size required for building, that they had rental inflation slow down and actually grow slower than the remainder of the state in their metro area, despite their being the most densely populated area of the state of Minnesota. So I just wanted to highlight those two scenarios quickly to show this isn't something that we're kind of spinning from whole cloth. This is best practice that's being adopted around the country in areas that have housing shortages, which is most of the country at this point. I was just speaking last Friday at a conference, and I was, speaking along with representatives in economic development from other communities, all in Southeast Michigan. We're the only West Side community, and everybody is taking a look at this problem. And what they're really running into is this root question of like, what kind of community do you want to be? And so, do you want to continue to make neighborhood living outside of urban core areas available to citizens? So what I mean by that is the only way to achieve these densities really is either allowing more density in your residential zones or increasing the number and scale and scope of your large multiplex housing facilities. And so, and that's something we're looking into as well. But I want to point out, we were very successful in this last round of LIHTC submissions in December, as most of you know. We're only community, we were the second most awarded community. We had 3 projects awarded. They account for 136 units, which is great. But at the price points that they're going to cover, they represent a pretty small percentage of the total gap over just the next 5 years. And it's going to be more and more difficult to replicate that success as we, continue to run out of project-based vouchers, as we continue to run out of folks from our partners at the Little River Band of Ottawa Indians to house with tribal credit points. This is not something that we can consistently achieve over a long period of time. So really looking at the fact that almost 40% of our land in the city is in these residential areas, that is where the most opportunity for housing infill exists. And we will be proposing recommendations that promote housing choice. And we want to know feedback today, as Jamie mentioned, as to what both boards have an appetite to consider after we do due diligence and public engagement on the topic. So with that, I think we're here to entertain any questions.
Thank you. So I'll open up to the City Commission first, then we'll go to the Planning Commission. Some of our members of our Planning Commission have already had an opportunity to see the presentation and ask questions at our last PC meeting, but we'll start with the City Commission first. So Commissioners, questions for staff on anything that's been presented this evening? Commissioner Kilgo.
I wanted to give the ladies first chance, but
I'm pulling mine up.
I have a couple questions. The projections that you were showing, are those with all available lots, or are those only the publicly available lots?
With all available lots.
So that is with private as well?
Yes. Numbers would be much lower if it was just the publicly owned lots.
Did that deliberately, and as Jamie mentioned, these are idealized scenarios, so we wanted to show that even in a perfect world where we could build the maximum allowed density in all these scenarios with all the available vacant land, we still don't hit the projection. But one thing that I would go back to is pointing out the situation in Maine where, because they eliminated barriers to regulation, it became more feasible for folks to build housing. And so if we can suddenly have someone who has, a 120-foot lot where they previously could only build 2 new houses, but now they can build 3 or 4 new houses, that may create marketability for the private market to continue our infill efforts, which we're seeing evidence of right now. Pretty much every entity that we've brought before you recently for infill housing has been happy to entertain lot splits that have been recommended by staff so that they can increase the number of units they're actually bringing online. But these are, again, idealized scenarios.
Thank you. And looking at all the options 1, 2, 3, and 4, in my day to day, I see the housing needs here in the city. Would be changing if this was something that went through and was adopted. We would be changing blanket the city if we change R1 to lower to smaller minimums.
Yeah, that's a great question. So what we wanted to focus on were things that could be applied community-wide in all residential districts. One of the big pieces of feedback we got when we proposed form-based code designation in some neighborhoods was hesitation because it was not being applied citywide. It was, okay, well, you're trying to do this in my neighborhood, but not this neighborhood, and I don't understand that, or I don't support that. Really, I think equitable distribution of the housing density opportunity provides a few things. It provides the most opportunity for everybody in those communities to benefit, and it also makes sure that we have consistent regulation across all members of our community despite different demographics by neighborhood, which, as we all know and as the housing study points out, we have severe disparities geographically, both economically and ethnically, in our neighborhoods. And so making it citywide is the most equitable solution from staff's perspective.
Sure. And then I know the benefits of form-based code. I would love to see form-based code in a lot more places in the city. I guess one thing, I'd like to look at your presentation, so when sometime this week or whenever, if you all could email that to the commissioners, I'd love to look at this if that's possible. Just to kind of to study it more, because we're already, like you said, we're being awarded, we're doing one of the best jobs in the state of Michigan with, building affordable housing, but housing in general, whether it's affordable or market rate, there's still a large need for it. And if we don't make some changes, we're still going to continue to lag behind. So I just love to look at the presentation some more, but I think that there's some good stuff here. Some good ideas.
Thank you, Commissioner Kilgo. Saw Commissioner Koshin about earlier. Okay,
Yeah.
Commissioner Koshin.
And you can have this. I don't have to refer to my phone, so thank you. So thank you guys for putting all this together and working with the Planning Commission on this. I guess for me, one of the things that I'm thinking about is that I have not gotten a whole lot of excitement in the ward that I represent for making more density in that area. So I definitely am not excited about one. um, a little bit less or a little bit more excited about two than one. And I do really like the idea of the accessory dwelling units because I know that that's something that constituents have come to me time and time again expressing interest in. And I know that it helps our seniors age in place with their parents. It helps parents help take care of their kids in this age where it's hard to buy a house. So I would be really on board with the accessible dwelling unit additions. One of the things that I do kind of wonder about is, with we're talking about density in these residential areas versus like apartment buildings. And I think that ultimately apartment buildings would be a better thing to kind of focus on as opposed to splitting up lots because I think we could definitely get a lot more people in an apartment building than we can just doing all of these individual lots split up.
Sure. I think that's a great observation. So I think it's a situation of like walking and chewing gum. And so if we look at the developable properties available for like larger format multiplex, we're relatively limited there as well. So we're working on a plan right now at the former General Hospital site on the very east end of the city that'll account for nearly 150 new apartments, and that's great. We don't have very many of those types of sites, and we're in talks basically with every large parcel of land that we think can be buildable for multifamily, even if they're privately owned. And so we've made those overtures. The commission was kind enough to grant us a budget for that this last fiscal year. We're going to take a little break and get 881st Street down this fiscal year with that money, but then we'll hope to be right back at that. But yeah, certainly, when you look at the capability of density per acre multifamily is higher. When you look at the total mass of land that the city currently exists in, that's where it becomes crucial to take a look at those residential areas. So I think it's a yes and. Absolutely, multifamily will continue to be an important aspect of the housing spectrum, both on the market rate side as well as the affordable side.
Right.
But I think the goal is, as I mentioned, really is trying to make sure that we make space for folks in every area of the city, no matter what their circumstances. And so, what I fear from someone who looks at this stuff every day is we create a sort of a dichotomous environment, which exists in some communities where you really only get to live in sort of low format residential districts if you have resources, and if you don't have resources, you tend to be in larger format multiplex, and that's quite candidly what sort of made HUD kind of tap out of building housing at all, several decades ago, as they had sort of created that dynamic in communities inadvertently. And so I think the goal with this regulation proposal is to make sure that we create opportunities in our neighborhoods for folks of all means, both market rate and subsidized.
Well, and I definitely think that when you were talking about splitting the houses up into different units within the home, I think that would help our current residents be able to afford their mortgages much more because then they can, split that up.
Yeah. That's a huge component. I think to Director Franzik's point earlier, maybe in a previous inspections environment, a lot of that stuff took place, before most of our time here, and it caused some consternation over time because we weren't diligent, perhaps, in upkeep of those folks, or we had landlords who maybe weren't as respectful of the neighborhoods as we would like. We feel, based on the enforcement data as well as the capacity of the inspections department, that we're in a better place, and that quite candidly the housing crisis demands that we look at these types of options so that people can supplement their income if you're an owner occupier and want to have an apartment, but also to allow people to create more density on existing homes that maybe wouldn't be dense if we didn't allow that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cochin. Commissioner Keener.
I know we've discussed we're planning in here a few times about tiny homes, and I was just thinking about me having my own property and me bringing my children because rent is just so expensive right now. Even them going to medical school, it's going to get more expensive. And with my grandmother aging and my mother aging, have you all kind of looked at aspects of what that might look like. Because, like for me, I wouldn't mind a dense population on property I own with my own family being situated there.
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you. So that's where the accessory dwelling unit regulations could come in, is making that an allowed use by right in residential areas. So you either construct a small format home or renovate an existing accessory structure on your property into like a new dwelling unit. And so right now, our minimum single residential square footage is 550 square feet. There's no official tiny home industry like standard. The going kind of industry definition is roughly 400 square feet. Many accessory dwelling units that would be built on lots today would have to be that or smaller. And so that accessory dwelling unit allowance and then the associated regulatory language would allow for that type of use if it was adopted.
So if I wanted to go, I'm big on those tiny home shows. So if I wanted to go like all the way down to like 300, that would be something that I could do.
As long as it was spelled out in the regulatory language that associated with that ADU, because right now we don't allow ADUs, and so we would have to write all that language regulating them, assuming that they were allowable. So we would have to define what the planning commission and the community and the city commission have an appetite for. So it might be 250 square feet, which I wouldn't advise because you're going to be cutting trusses in half, or it could be 300 square feet, something like that. So, but the short answer is yes, ADU regulation would pave the way for that to be allowable. Yep.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Keener. Vice Mayor St. Clair.
I appreciate all of the work and creativity put into this. I know that this has been a really complex and complicated and fraught situation that we're navigating. I appreciate the urgency to make change before it's too late, and I also appreciate the delicacy which you guys have practiced in trying to navigate this. So thank you for that. I really like the both and idea that you were referencing. Like we have to take a broad approach that covers a lot of opportunity, and I think that this set of recommendations is going to move us well in that direction. And I also appreciate the thoughtfulness, and nobody said the word, but to avoid gentrification. To Director Echolm, your point that if we pick and choose which neighborhoods we enforce, or which neighborhoods we allow to avoid density changes, then you are negatively impacting the rest of the community in ways that's unfair and unjust. And I just wanted to acknowledge that I understand and I see that that is deliberately worked in here, and I appreciate that a lot. So thank you.
Thank you very much. I appreciate that feedback, and it actually jogged my memory on one more point I wanted to try to make sure everyone understood. So the other thing, when I mentioned we're not inventing this out of whole cloth, we're also really only proposing uses that would allow things to get built that quite candidly already exist in all of these neighborhoods already. I'll pick on myself in this example, as I often do. My former residence on Southern, within a quarter mile in either direction, I had duplex, triplex, quadplex, and small multifamily apartment complex next to my single family house. And so these things have historically been allowable. It's really only with trends through the 90s and well, I'd say the 80s through the early 2000s in single family zoning as a definition nationwide, we weren't alone, where these things were precluded because of this perception that they had a negative impact on neighborhoods. But what we found is from an affordability standpoint in city settings, which have built-in density, built-in utilities, and associated costs of maintenance, that sort of more suburbanized zoning really takes away the ability to provide high-level public services and to allow people to be adequately housed. So really all we're proposing in this, other than maybe you could argue the parking minimums, though I think we had no parking minimum at one point way back when. Yeah. We're really just asking to put things back so that people could build stuff like it already exists today. So thank you for that point.
Thank you, Vice Mayor St. Clair. Commissioner Gorman, anything to ask or add at this time?
Sorry. Can you go over the parking minimums again, or can we just go back to those slides real quick?
Okay, so was there a specific point that you wanted me to reiterate here?
So
or
is
just-
this, I guess, what I want to make sure we're not doing is this, and then finding out, like, no. What I'm getting at is I hope we're continuing to build a city that people actually don't need vehicles for, right? If they live in the city, they don't necessarily need a vehicle to get everything they need. So I just want to make sure this isn't counter to that.
No, definitely not. It's very much moving in that direction, and it's the idea of accommodating cars, but not letting cars drive everything that happens in your city. And mention in here that site plans are often driven by parking requirements, and per the chart that I explained here, only 4 of the apartment buildings in the city exceed what we require currently. Everything else is at or below it. If we continue to require it, people will continue to have to build up to that number of units. If we eliminate parking minimums or reduce them, people will build what they find to be necessary. The ultimate option here, or the ultimate goal here, is that you partner this with things that are happening outside of this. The Complete Streets policy, which is coming before you all tomorrow evening, the Greenways plan that's being worked on. All of these are means of allowing for transportation, but not requiring that that transportation happen via a private automobile. What we're getting at here is that a continuation of that way of traveling in the city has pros and cons. Obviously, it's easier to drive to a lot of places right now, but it comes at the expense of other means of transportation. So our public transportation system, MATS, they're constantly fighting people choosing to get around different ways. And what we're facing from a housing perspective is that we're allocating land in our city to storage, aka parking of private automobiles. And oftentimes it's not warranted. We're hearing from developers that the requirements that we have in place right now are too high, and they would much prefer to build less than what we're requiring at a minimum. So this recommendation is solely focused on allowing parking to continue to be built, but at in an amount that is relevant and is appropriate for what it's being used for.
Got it. And then can we go back to also then the option 3, or yeah. So can you go to the next slide, Jamie? Thank you. So is this the parameters around making sure we're not having people just cut up houses to put up units in just because they can? Again, it has to make sense. We're seeing sorry. The entrances that need to be in the existing house for this to be an option for them, correct?
Yeah, so what this slide gets at is what our current form-based code allows for in terms of design requirements, which really pushes new construction to conform with what you see throughout the neighborhood, and bringing things into the neighborhood that would fit into the neighborhood visually. What we're proposing here is maybe eliminating a few of these requirements if we were to incorporate them into some sort of a zoning amendment for the rest of the city, with the idea that these requirements often come with a price tag as well. Not all housing really needs to meet all of these requirements. In some places it makes a lot of sense, and I think with the form-based code it started out with a very small area and has grown from there as we've rezoned different parts of the city, mainly in the Nelson neighborhood and into the NIMS neighborhood. Those bring great things. The design requirements have a lot of benefits that come with them, but we also acknowledge that with the housing shortage that we're facing, we have to be very aware of where expense comes in when building housing, and how do we keep affordability at the forefront and how do we make sure that we're not going too far in one direction and making it difficult to build?
Okay, that's all. Thank you.
Commissioner Gorman? Yes, Commissioner Kilgo.
Thank you. I just have a couple of follow-up questions. Just getting a chance to see this. I want to talk about safety for just a second. So on the old R1, we had side setbacks set of 6 feet for a 1-story and 8 feet for a 2-story. The recommended amendment would be 5 feet side setbacks regardless of the height of the building. And then maximum height limit of 35 feet. We have an older house on, let's say, lot 1. We pass all the recommended changes. We have a new 30-foot road frontage requirement or minimum lot widths. And we stick a smaller house, or we stick, yeah, I guess it would be smaller with a 30-foot minimum lot width. And then we have an older house on the other side. Do we just, like, from a safety standpoint, have we talked with public safety and the fire department and things like that as far as the safety of having smaller setbacks and more density with, I mean, I guess technically a developer could come in and say, I want to maximize, we're going to make each one of these 35 feet tall. And there's only 5 feet in between each of the buildings. Well, 10 feet because setbacks on each side. But from a safety standpoint, have we talked and looked at that stuff? Just because I myself know that it's definitely going to be a concern to some people, like the safety of more denser housing.
Sure. Yeah. So a lot of the infill housing that's happened in the core neighborhoods, Nelson, McLaughlin, happens either in the form-based code urban residential context area or our R3 zones. So a lot of those regulations are already in place where we're seeing new housing. The 5-foot setback aligns with the building code's requirement for fire suppression and essentially whether a wall is, trying to think of the exact phrasing for that.
So if they're within a 5-foot setback, they require dense glass. That's what the code requires, which is a fire preventative addition in your siding, under your siding and on your eaves. And if you go to 6 feet, you don't need it. So.
Right. Yeah. So 5 feet, just to say it into the microphone, 5 feet requires dense glass as a fire suppression method in neighboring walls, basically. If you go to 6 feet, you're far enough to not require that. So that is the safety measure that's in place for anything that builds that close. And for instance, with the example that you gave, if a neighboring house is existing and maybe 1 or 2 feet off the property line, any distance that is closer than that, it's going to be required that the new building has dense glass on that side.
For instance, an example would be like the Leonard Street houses. Those are probably, I mean, they're pretty close together, so that's probably something like 5 feet setbacks there. That one is 6 feet, because I know that they require certain glass on the sides of the house because of their.
Tempered glass in the bedrooms and windows on the second floor is code so that you don't have a slip and fall.
Okay. Perfect. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kilgo. Kind of piggybacking on that, when you indicated that if it's 5 feet separation, it requires the dense glass sheeting. To what extent? I'm just curious about the cost of that. Like, because part of what our intent is to reduce costs, and so if this is now going to require every house that's built under the recommended zoning to have this dense glass sheeting, what's that cost component being added to that?
Yeah, so it's not 5 feet between houses, it's 10 feet total, it's a 5-foot setback. And that isn't an immediate mandate, basically. So you can build a house that meets a 6-foot setback, for instance, on one of these lots. Obviously, not all of the lots are going to be built out to exactly 30 feet wide, and not all houses are going to be exactly 20 feet wide to meet those setbacks. We see a variety of them, and oftentimes when we're working with developers, they do try to avoid that because there is a cost that is tied to including dense glass versus just standard residential construction. I don't know if there's. Essentially not a prerequisite that it's
So, yeah, it's
going
not a
to be.
prerequisite, it's a minimum, but are we setting ourselves up in a situation where if we are saying everything's 30 feet minimum lead and we started seeing parcels at 30 feet, like, are we going to create a dynamic where houses would, by naturally, because of the zoning and development patterns, that it's naturally going to be 5 feet from the side setback, 5 feet for each. You know what I'm saying? Are you following what I'm trying
I hear you.
trying to
So,
get at here?
like, the oversimplified answer is potentially. So if you have a bunch of new 30-foot lots and people want to build a lot plan that pushes that setback, say, yep, we're gonna be 5 feet on a side, then those would require Dens glass. Dens glass is an additional cost. Relative to the total of the housing unit, it's, not nothing, but it's not a substantial cost, like maybe like a suppression system would be, that can be cost prohibitive. That being said, many of these would be built adjacent to existing houses that already exist and far exceed like that 5 foot, 10-foot total setback, and then would potentially cause the new house to no longer require Dens glass because they've got enough life safety distance from that existing house to not need it. So in a scenario where you are building multiple new structures, a good example is the new fourplexes on Dowd Street that were recently completed by Camp Belfield Park. Those are, I believe, 5 feet apart on the outside walls, and so they have Dens glass only on those exterior walls where they face each other. But then the outside walls, the houses next to them on the one side are farther than the 5 foot setback, and so they didn't need to put Dens glass on that exterior wall. I think that's a good example. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. That's good context. Commissioner Cochin.
Yeah, I had a follow up to piggyback off of that. Sorry. What exactly is Dens glass, first and foremost? And second of all, is it something that when the owner has to replace it, is it going to be a difficult material for them to find to replace?
Well, the only instance where you'd have to replace it is if you had a fire. So ideally, you won't have to replace it. But it's an exterior component that is a building material used in place of traditional exterior Tyvek drywall or Tyvek exterior coating. It's basically an additional fire retardant layer that goes on the outside of a structure in any areas where fire could escape. So in your soffit and fascia, your eaves, certain areas, certain types of exterior siding facade, depending on how your layout is, in order to prevent, if your house is on fire, if the house next door is on fire, to prevent that fire from catching your house on fire.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. And just to follow up, it's not like if it's something like that did happen, it's not going to be, people would be able to find it, right?
Oh, well, yeah, so typically what would happen most likely is that if you had the neighboring house catch fire and then you had damage, like either their insurance or your insurance would basically mandate that work be done under a contractor prescribed by either you or your insurance company, and the contractor would be able to locate it. Yeah.
Okay.
It's not something we would go typically to like Home Depot and find ourselves.
Thank you.
Commissioner Cochin. Any other questions right now before I go to the Planning Commission? I do have a question. Mentioned fires. So what I'm wondering is, in seeing the recommended amendment that's on here, where we're talking about going everything with R1, but reducing the minimum lot size for R1 to 3,000 square feet, reduce minimum lot width to 30 feet, keep the same maximum lot coverage of 50% for buildings, 10% for pavement, 2 stories height limit up to 35 feet here, same, 10 to 30 feet, same, 15 feet setback, and then just a little change with the side setback. So what I'm wondering though, because this is pertaining to another item that's on our agenda tomorrow, with the potential change from R1 to R2 for the neighborhood in the Beechwood Bluff neighborhood, Pure Marquette area, along Nelson. One of the rationales for that change is that the existing lots as they're zoned are complicated because they don't align up with what the original zoning was, or the original development patterns are. So if they were to get burned down or more than 75% destruction, they wouldn't be able to be rebuilt there as use by right in that particular area or in that particular lot. So are we unintentionally recreating that in some regards if we went with this? And so if you've got a house that's already in R2 or R3 and now we're going to R1 and whereas R2, R3 previously allowed you to have maximum lot coverage up to 60 and 70%, and now it's 50%. Are we, inadvertently creating these situations that property owners in the future would be inhibited from replacing their homes, or are we looking at other ways to mitigate that?
That's a great question. So it actually wouldn't. It would be going the other way. It would be helping more units. So if we had a 49-foot wide lot in a R1 district and it was 1 foot short, now the new rule would be you only need 30 foot. So it would bring everybody closer towards conformance.
So I'm talking about the lot coverage specifically.
Oh, the lot coverage.
Because you were allowing 70% lot coverage in R3, 60% lot coverage in R2, and if we're all moved to R1, the lot coverage is 50%. And so are we potentially creating situations where you exceed that lot coverage and then would not be able to rebuild?
For the rebuilding, maybe that's something we need to look at a little bit closer, is what those building percentages would be. I don't think there's a lot of houses throughout the community that are approaching that or over it, so I think we have a lot of wiggle room. So we could probably study that a little bit closer, just to make sure we're not bringing people in. Because it wouldn't be a problem, they'd be grandfathered in, but you're right, if they wanted to rebuild it and they meet everything, but they're 72% lot coverage instead of 70, that could cause an issue. I don't think that'll be a problem, but that's something we will look into, and we can have that information ready at those public meetings.
Okay. Yep. Something I want us to be mindful of.
Yeah.
While we're trying to solve this other issue, not unintentionally creating another issue. That's why I was just curious.
Yeah, I think there could be a typo. I think we were trying to replicate the higher numbers, so really in the green side, that probably should be at 70 and 15 or 70 and 20. So maybe it'd be better to put those on the higher end than on the lower end.
So now so your intent for this recommendment is actually having maximum lot coverage of buildings at 70% and pavement at 20%?
That's something that we could consider or talk about and discuss. So,
Okay.
Yes.
So some fun. Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay. Maybe up to 90%. Oof. I don't know how I feel about that. Okay.
And I did want to
see
make
follow-up?
sure we were clear on the dense glass.
Uh-huh.
To my understanding, dense glass is needed if you don't have 10 foot in between houses. So keeping the 5 foot setback on a bunch of new houses, we're going to achieve that. The time when we come into a problem is if we have this new 30 foot wide lot and there's an existing house with only a 2 foot setback, then we're only going to get 7 feet. So that's when the dense glass usually is required. So.
Okay. Follow-up, Commissioner?
I did. So, Director Franzik, I just kind of wanted to follow up because when you were talking about the situation that the mayor was discussing with the maximum lot coverage, and you said that they would be grandfathered in, we're kind of talking about doing this across the entire city, correct?
Yes.
So, in my mind, the situation we're dealing with tomorrow seems like it's a little bit different. So, is it the same? Are the people in that scenario that we're going to be talking about tomorrow, are they got grandfathered in?
Well, they're grandfathered
I just want to try
in
to understand so I
s-
can compare it while I'm thinking about
Sure.
things.
So they're grandfathered in, which means that they can be there. They can exist. We're not asking anything of them. They may have issues, as the mayor pointed out. If we went to 50% and some of them are already at 70, yeah, they'd be grandfathered in, but they'd have a lot of problems rebuilding if there was an accident. So that's something we really want to make sure we're not going to do. But I
Okay.
think we're okay because most lots don't get that close.
So you guys are going to take a look at it though,
Yeah,
to move it up
yes.
from
Yeah,
50? Okay.
yeah.
Okay, thank you. We'll go to the Planning Commission now with your questions and thoughts. You want to?
Can I ask a question?
Yeah, absolutely.
Mayor Johnson first. Are you looking at this time just for questions or comments as well?
We'll initially I was going to do questions and then comments, but we're doing questions and comments at the same time. So yeah, have at it. I'm withholding my comments right now, but yeah.
So I'll defer to I have a number of questions and comments, but I'll defer to my colleagues.
One of my questions already got answered. I was just wondering about like a private owner, how we incentivize them to want to switch their lots, and you kind of answered it. I stay on right now. I live on a smaller lot, and I have a lot that's next
Excuse me, I'm sorry. Could you use the microphone so the folks at home can hear?
I'm sorry.
Anyone watching?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Is the light on?
It was on. I think you turned it off.
There we go.
I was just wondering, and I believe Mike answered it, or Jake. How do we incentivize the private owners that own the majority of the lots in the land in the city to want to build on the land? He answered that by splitting a lot. It kind of incentivizes them. I currently, right now, live next to a small empty lot. I think it's zoned under R3. I'm not sure. But nobody has built on it. So I was just wondering what would be the incentive for private owners, and he kind of answered that.
And then I just have a question about the vacant land that you're asking. Does that include vacant housing as well?
Just vacant lots, I believe.
Just lots?
That.
Because I can think of at least 3 vacant houses just driving through.
Yeah, so this analysis only includes vacant lots. What we didn't account for yet, but we could account for is, say you have a house that you live in and you buy, at some point in time, you bought the neighboring vacant lot and merged it with your lot. You could split those if the minimum lot sizes were smaller. We didn't account for any of those splits quite yet, for a variety of more technical reasons. We don't know how the house is exactly placed on the lot, and we don't know if a split's possible. So this is specifically focused on vacant lots that have no house and are not part of somebody's side yard.
Okay, and that's good to know. And then I know there's been a lot of discussion with the commission with the short-term rental issue. Has there been any discussion about working a little bit more on the short-term rental issue to accommodate more permanent housing versus the Airbnb thing?
That's a good question. So on the short-term rental issue, the city manager's office is leading a team that will be bringing potential policy solutions on that issue specifically, without getting into the weeds too much because it's still being drafted by staff. Effectively, we're taking a look at geographic areas and their percentage of total housing and making it a ratio of that. So over the course of time, our goal is to, work with the existing housing stock that we have and the existing vacant land that we have. So if we're looking at a housing gap, it is true that a short-term rental takes away like a permanent housing dwelling or the potential for it. That being said, that dwelling is there and has the potential to pretty quickly return to a long-term dwelling. It's a matter of an owner's decision making, whereas we're really heavily focused on vacant property because there's no housing opportunity there at this time.
These are just some notes that I made, so they're not necessarily all questions. But we talked about alleys a little bit in the past, and so kind of thinking about where we all live, you think about the housing around you and how that might be impacted. There are some really deep properties where I currently live, which is on Grand. And so is there any potential to kind of work through some of these alley conversions so that people could actually access properties better through these alleys, and maybe turn them into lanes or something like that?
So I think the city has many, many alleys, and they vary widely as to their condition. And without my colleague in Public Works here to stare daggers at me, I'm going to decline to opine on that. But that being said, we, from a zoning standpoint, our goal is to promote rear-loaded, entry and car parking as much as possible to every residential lot. So wherever there is an alley, I think our goal from a land use standpoint, not necessarily from a accessibility standpoint, because that's not something we control, but it is the city's goal, would be to promote alleys as the primary way that people access their property where they are present.
Okay, just because they take up a lot of space. There's a lot of empty space in the
They
middle
do.
of the block that's not being used. So I just wanted to kind of bring that to bear. You answered some of the minimum square footage questions, and then you talked about the percentage of pavement that is kind of happening on some of these properties. do we have a requirement that the driveways must be paved as of now? Because sometimes gravel, I'm just saying that, just to throw it out there, that gravel is sometimes a better solution for that. But I understand it's taking up space. So it's really more of a comment. And then my question on the parking requirement is that we do have to keep in mind that even though we want to promote getting around in other ways, we now require people to move back and forth across the street if they park in the street every time it snows. And it's not something that people can necessarily do very easily based on their scheduling, so I just want to make sure that we continue to keep that in mind. And then more importantly, we have a lot of actual vacant houses. Houses that are boarded up, that are just not being lived in. And so within this planning process, how are we engaging with the folks that own the properties that currently are boarded up, have had house fires, have just been dilapidated?
I mean, I know it's just a comment, but yes, we do have a requirement that parking on your property be paved, not gravel. I think that stems from longstanding issues with probably a handful of properties where the gravel gets out of control, the parking area isn't well defined anymore, and as many of us have seen, even many of our alleys are gravel, and some of that starts to spread out into the sidewalk and cause issues in terms of getting around for others. You'd asked about vacant houses, so we have vacant building fees, which I believe apply to houses as well. So we're aware of those, but as long as the fees are paid, there's really nothing we can do to again. Definitely a component of what's leading to this shortage, but not the only thing.
Those are good points on the housing side of things. I'll also make up for my alley comment and score one for DPW that gravel driveways are really hard on storm sewers, and so they'll appreciate me saying that. Now that being said, something I want to focus on to your mention of vacant houses, and so one of the other policy recommendations that we're going to be working our way through as staff, and this is a heavy lift, it's complex because most of them are privately held at this point, and the land bank, the ones they have funds available for rehab, and they're working diligently to do that, which is great. They've been very successful at a statewide blight elimination grant, multiple stages, multiple awards, including recently one to go towards Frebel School, which is great. So, but the privately owned ones, housing preservation has to be like a key component to our housing policy framework. And so not simply, only looking to include new housing in our community, but to assist and incentivize where necessary and possible the preservation of our existing housing stock.
That was my last comment, actually.
Yeah, and so the most complicated ones of those, we do a lot of that already. Director Sharonda Carson in CNS and her team, they give out hundreds of thousands, over $1 million a year often in assistance grants to people for facades, roofs, all kinds of things that are income qualified folks. The challenge with that is a couple-fold. One, HUD dollars are required to go to people under 80% of the area median income. But a lot of folks that are at 100% of the AMI are having difficulty with housing preservation and housing maintenance costs. The other challenge with the privately held homes is something that I'm sure we've talked about before at the podium, which is the prevalence of what we call institutional sales. And so people that buy property sight unseen and, basically use it as a tax shelter, a capital gains shelter. Many of these homes are LLC held, and they're effectively being used to never with any intention of redevelopment. So identifying who owns them, and then also if they have any appetite to acquire them at something reasonable that would leave any market parity left to rehab them is a difficult lift. And so we are aware, and we are working on solutions, but housing preservation will be a core component of our housing policy framework.
Can I just finish up with, that was kind of my next comment was, Commissioner Kilgo and I have talked about, the first step of being a homeowner is acquiring the house. And the next step is maintaining it. And not everybody learns how to do that through their life, or they don't always have the support to do that. So I think any opportunity where we can, as a city, promote those skills through workshops, and not just to folks who are income limited, but maybe just, again, didn't acquire that information, I think would go a really long way in maintaining what we have in good condition, because mowing lots and maintaining these vacant houses to be presentable encourages people to live in the neighborhood, makes everything feel safer, and we need to keep that top of mind too.
Great, thank you.
I'll make a comment comparable to last month, where I'm fully supportive of us moving forward into continuing this investigation and these presentations, because I think it's essential that we once again provide the flexibility that we need to provide as much housing at different styles, types, price points as possible to allow people from first-time homeowners or renters to empty nesters who want to stay in their current neighborhood, unload the old house, and maybe move into one of the new duplexes so they can maintain their ties to the community that, you know, they've lived in for the past 40 or 50 years. The other thing is I think we need to really keep focused on that we are talking at this point is how we can address a very real housing shortage with an overabundance of empty dirt, okay? And a lot of that empty dirt used to have houses on it. And we were a city of almost 50,000 people at one point in our history, and we still have all that infrastructure, all right? We are currently at right around 37,000 people, give or take. So 37,000 people are paying for the infrastructure that we once upon a time had for 50,000 people, and 2,000 person industrial complexes that used to, you know, contribute to the wastewater treatment center, and, you know, used our water, and they're not here anymore. And we got to pay those legacy fees, because you don't build those type of things once, call it good. That's a 100-year, 200-year-old obligation. We need to continue to rebuild the city in order to pay our bills and provide the quality of the standard of services that we would like. And plus, it's nice to have new neighbors. And we were 50,000 before. You know, it's not going to get overly crowded. Again, looking at this, one thing I had recommended that just be prepared when you're talking about density is to let people know that density does not equate to overcrowding or congestion. Okay, density is what we do as far as, you know, we're talking about density, the use on a particular piece of property. I really appreciated Mr. Pesh coming up with the reality that zoning and parking science really isn't. It's arbitrary. It grew out of the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and the 50s, and we really don't know why, except, you know, maybe somebody wanted everything to look like a beautiful, what was that, Garden City movement in the 1920s. And zoning had a good intent. It really did, you know, back in the day. But most of the zoning that we see that we're utilizing now grew out of the movement to address these nasty tenements that were built in, you know, the late 1800s. And it was a safety factor, all right? But we tended to go a little overboard with our need for control as we moved into the 20th century and in the post-World War II era. So my recommendation is, for as boring as it might seem for some, you know, of ourselves and neighbors, I think a good look at history and how arbitrary this stuff really is, because we have put a lot of stuff in place, but at the same time, we're a 19th century town. And look how much illegal housing we have, including on what, you know, what you're coming back to address for a second reading tomorrow. We created that. That's a creation strictly of definition. And a lot of some of the item that came up late maybe are concerns with 70%, 50%, or whatever you can rebuild. Tomorrow night's issue is very much an example of that's what you cause by definition. So, you know, that can be handled. I don't doubt it. But I really think that this is essential that we continue to move forward. I've always been a proponent of, the form-based code or the neighborhood context, and short of that, we have to get rid of the requirement for single-family housing. And now remember, even if we go, where we allow all the different housing types in all neighborhoods, the change provides for an allowance. This in no way requires anything. So even if we adopted this, chances are everybody and their brother would continue to build single-family houses. But perchance, if somebody wanted to put up that duplex, triplex, small quad, this provides for it. It's an allowance. It's not a requirement. And I think that's another thing we have to be very succinct when we, once again, provide this to the public. But for me, unless we go back to the way we grew this town in the first place before we had these arbitrary requirements of zoning and, 3 parking spaces per 1 bedroom or whatever it happens to be, and I'm just being flip, cities grew okay. But we're frozen in amber and penalized in their ability to continue to evolve when guaranteed mortgage securities and blacklisting and red zoning no longer provided, cities to grow, let alone get a loan to, fix your roof, because those monies were only available if you were building new, after World War II. It's essential that we give all the facts, as tedious it may seem to some people, but I really, really feel we need to move forward at a citywide level and give ourselves the flexibility that we need, that over the next 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years, we can once again grow organically and flexibly, and we will truly benefit. We will truly benefit.
Anybody else on the planning commission want to make some comments? Mike, I want to preface my questions with saying that while I understand the approach here, I am concerned about what I guess I'll call shoehorning development into small lots. And I have some experience in dealing with that. I remember some years ago in the city, particularly in probably some of the more dense neighborhoods, where there was a number of problems with small lots that didn't have adequate parking, and so you had people parking where they didn't need to be, where they shouldn't be, on other people's property, and had a lot of people in homes that created some difficulties in those neighborhoods, just too many people in the homes. And some of that was because some of those properties were illegally converted into multifamily homes. But regardless of that, they were what they were, whether they were originally permitted or not. But what we're talking about now is allowing some of those same things. And it may work just fine, but I think we have to kind of remember, I guess, where we've been and where we're in terms of how we're going to go forward in the future. So I'm concerned about that, and I think of some examples where some smaller lots have already been allowed. I think about Terrace Point, and I guess I'd like to know. I should know this probably, but what were the lot sizes there? And particularly for both the single family and the duplexes there, because they're relatively close, and they seem to be working fine right now. It's an attractive development, I think, and so that might be a shining example of what we can do. But I also know that was a PUD, and so some things were allowed, even though those lot sizes might not have been allowed by the existing zoning or the zoning at the time. Those lots were allowed because of the PUD. So can someone talk about that or comment on that?
I think, yes, I think so. So I think at this point, the reason that we're recommending the ability to convert existing single-family into multiple units only in form-based code designated areas is specifically because they have stricter design criteria and external design criteria, and it was kind of sort of laid out in that slide, quite a bit of detail that can be looked over later. That makes it more selective as to how that can be done relative to just allowing that carte blanche throughout the city. I think similar regulatory language could be incorporated if there was appetite to allow that as a use citywide. The other thing that I would harken back to is my comment earlier in the presentation that I think the inspections environment is much more robust today due to more resources and just change in regulation and change in the building code, which would allow for more adequate enforcement. I would also point to more robust parking enforcement than we've had in recent years with additional staff, things like that. And I can tell you with confidence that they do ticket in residential areas with personal experience, which is good. So I think that it's about creating the environment that allows the most housing by right and also regulating that environment with common sense local ordinance. And so I, for one, would lend towards a recommendation that trusts our staff in various divisions to make the sound environment that people all pay for in their community. As to the lot sizes at Terrace Point, I was actually sneakily trying to look it up on Property Viewer while you were commenting, and I believe they are under 50 foot. But I will verify that.
That's for the single family or for the
They're under.
duplex?
I got it right here. They're under 40 feet. They're about 36 to 39 feet.
Okay.
Most of the
So,
lots in Terrace Point
okay,
Landing.
but what about for the duplexes?
They're also duplexes are. Oh wait, nope. Sorry.
They're probably condos, so you have to add two of them together.
So they sit on one lot.
Yeah. So yeah, it's not gonna give me the.
But, what's being proposed is 40 feet for duplexes.
Yes.
Right? So, and that's why I asked that question, because that might be a good example about whether that's a good thing or not.
Yeah, that's a great point. And I also think you'll see a prevalence of construction for, when it comes to duplexes specifically, of a lot of like up-down duplexes rather than side-by-side to basically match the existing condition of the neighborhoods, which I think both the Planning Commission, when this presentation was given to you, as well as our feedback from the public has been, we don't want things to sort of stick out like a sore thumb. And then obviously within the realm of the law, allowing people to build what they have a right to build on their own property through the building code, we want to promote that too. And so I think you're going to see a lot of two-story up-down duplex installation on 40-foot lots. Obviously wider lots provide opportunity for side-by-side. And I would bet, I'm guessing those ones at Terrace Point are probably 60 feet is my
So
guess.
they don't break it down, but you can kind of infer in some areas. So one duplex, the first duplex coming off of the single family, you do see a width of 81 feet, 81.7 feet for that one. And then the next two duplexes, so we're talking about 4 units altogether, that's 149.41 feet for that, so about 75 feet.
So they're significantly larger than the 40 feet. Yeah.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, they're also larger format homes. They're as compared with a lot of what you would see in our denser neighborhoods.
Right, but my point is they're fairly close together, and yet they're still larger than the 40 feet, significantly larger. So it's just something to keep in mind. And Jake, you mentioned the existing single-family homes need to meet the duplex requirements for conversion, but you have any idea how many of those would meet those requirements? I mean,
not offhand, no. That's something that I think.
Is it a large number or a small number?
To meet the design criteria of the form-based code in our neighborhoods, I don't dare speculate how many housing units. Obviously, there are thousands of them, so it would be pretty difficult for me to tell based only on my own anecdotal drive experiences. I think it would be a pretty narrow scope of housing, and I would argue that scope would be even further narrowed by the people that would have the interest in actually doing it.
And you mentioned, and I guess moving in another direction a little bit, you mentioned earlier about where you lived at one point and the multiple types of uses of housing. And that's all well and good, but there are some areas that are solely single family, and this would impact those areas potentially. And in some ways, maybe positively, but maybe for some people, not in a positive way. And so I think that we need to think about that too, because if this is enacted, then it opens that door.
Yeah, potentially. I think that's the reason that we really want to promote public engagement on this topic and allow people to ask questions that maybe we haven't contemplated, or to give us feedback so that we can adjust these regulatory recommendations. I think oftentimes it's difficult to not look at the data in the housing study and not think of the people that may end up unhoused in the community or may not be able to live in the community, and to see those as not see those as larger problems than problems that density might create.
And to talk about the parking for a minute, you talked about, you had a slide, and I don't need to see it, but you had a slide that showed the number of current multiple family projects that had more or less of the required parking. But I'm guessing, I'm not sure, but I'm guessing that many of those are older projects, projects that have been done many years ago, and they don't meet maybe the requirements now, but maybe they did at the time, or they were done under a PUD and weren't required. And I guess it's anybody's opinion as to how well that's working.
Yeah, I think as with any idealized scenario, it's a matter of some speculation, right? And so what I would argue is, when looking at that slide that shows the parking minimums and then the parking ratios, what we are hearing from potential new developers, and I would also say that one of the reasons that we're in the pickle we're in is that most of our multifamily is older because we haven't built very much of it in a long time when looked at against the scale of like a Park Terrace or a Glen Oaks, like these large format multifamily sites with hundreds of units. There's a real need for that. And what we're seeing on the one that we're working on now, which is the largest prospective infill multifamily housing project, they have basically said that with the benefit of hindsight, they've overbuilt their parking in some areas. So they're looking at a ratio of somewhere in the 1.6, I want to say, is there? Yeah, like 1.6 spots basically to accommodate for, families with teenage children, visitors, things like that. But in many cases, the minimums that are created in our single family zones are arbitrary. As was mentioned, it was increased from 1 to 2 for reasons unknown at this point. So taking a look at the fact that these folks that are building, to Commissioner Cochin's point, the densest housing we have, and they're coming in under our required minimum, I think speaks to Planner Pesch's point that it likely makes the most sense to let developers determine the most economical way to incorporate parking.
I tend to agree with that, and I think maybe, the 2 spots per unit, maybe that was overcooked, but I think you can, in a multi-unit complex, you can share the parking. And in single family, you don't have that ability. And so I think that we still have to be aware of the need for the parking in a single, I say single family, but whatever we want to end up calling R1 in the future. I think that's still important. I think there's a distinction between the single family or duplex versus the multifamily.
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think an important distinction also is the prevalence of street parking in our single family, or whatever we want to call them, like not giant multifamily zoning districts, and the fact that it is widely underutilized in many neighborhoods because of the prevalence for, inappropriate parking, as you mentioned earlier, people parking on the terrace, people parking in the backyard. But I think to Commissioner Gorman's point earlier about trying to lean in policy directions that don't create car-dependent communities, facilitating requirements that basically dictate we build on the bulk of our vacant property to accommodate vehicles that we're actually trying to build a community that is not dependent on, seems antithetical. And so I think that's where we're coming from there.
Okay. I just have 2 other things real quick. One has to do with the build out that under the recommended amendment, having a little bit of trouble understanding how all that works. And my math is different, and maybe it's new math that I just don't understand. But so you have a 3,000 square foot lot with a 30 feet minimum width, and so you have a 5-foot side yard setback, right? And a 15-yard rear setback, and is it a minimum 10-foot front setback?
It's a build-to zone, so anywhere between 10 and 30 feet.
But a 10 at minimum. Okay, so when I take all those into account, and then I look at, and so I look at, on the coverage of the land, you could get 1,500 square feet covered on a 3,000 square foot lot, but we're allowing a 70% build out, which is 2,100 square feet. So what am I missing?
I'm gonna go ahead and do that shorthand the same way you did while I was talking earlier. But I'm pretty sure that this contemplates the significant depth of most of our narrow lots. And so if you look at that 15-foot setback, many of these lots are 125 feet deep.
But if I take a 30 by 100 lot, which is 3,000 square feet,
Right.
and then I apply the setbacks, I only get 1,500 square feet.
Yeah, and that's most likely what the. Yeah, I'm gonna let Jamie
So,
speak to it.
yeah, I mean, maybe I'm just not understanding.
So the setbacks would take precedent over the lot coverage.
So in those cases, you wouldn't be able to build out 70%.
Right,
You'd be
because
able to
you'd
build
hit
out
your
whatever
setbacks
whatever
already.
you could get.
Right, and the 70% is more in place to accommodate existing housing. So houses that maybe were built before the setbacks that we have today, we wanted to have provisions in there that would allow for that to exist in as close to its original form as possible. So again, sort of like what we're talking about with Nelson and Beach Street rezonings, accommodating what's there too. So we're trying to keep an eye toward what could be and what is.
Okay, so my last question is, I'm interested in knowing, because I'm sure this has been talked about, how do you see this new recommended zoning amendment warding off gentrification?
Well, I think Jake's slides at the end of the presentation were very clear in what has worked in other cities. And what we're finding ourselves in right now is a supply and demand issue where we don't have the supply to meet the demand. And what took place in Minneapolis, for instance, they were able to get out in front of the higher demand and provide the supply that would meet that demand. And it proved across statewide that they would have lower rental rates, lower increases in their rental rates. And I think that's one of the big things that we're pushing for here is a lot of people, I think, at times will consider any new development to be gentrification, if we're going to call it that. It would be a situation where whatever gets built is somehow unattainable to the people that are living here now. And I think what our concern is that in whatever ways, in this case zoning, whatever ways we might stifle new development today is going to lead to a smaller supply and a higher demand going into the future. If we don't build to keep up with that demand, the pricing for housing that exists today is going to go up.
My last thing, I lied, I did have one more thing. In term, the question came up about incentives for the private owners because there's so many more privately owned property than publicly owned. Are there ideas or programs that you're going to roll out that are going to provide financial incentives, not just?
Yeah, I think there would be, so Jake mentioned the strategic housing implementation plan that we're putting together. There are going to be options in there where we can take steps to encourage people to sell their lots. I think in an ideal scenario, we would, not in the same way that we've been talking about all day, but I think we would like to get to a point where the value of land in the city is high enough to encourage people to do things. Right now, we constantly run into such low land values in parts of the city that it almost makes more financial sense to sit on the property and not really do anything with it. But if the demand, and in this case, we're starting to see some of this, you're seeing development on vacant lots that isn't being initiated by the city, that is proof that you're finally seeing a private market for development of land where it previously didn't exist. So in some ways, we're hoping that as things continue to play out, it'll take care of itself. People will see the value in either building or selling their land that maybe they've used for a larger side yard for all these years, or they acquired for some reason or another in the past.
And one quick follow-up I want to mention, and that was very correctly put. So the goal is to create equity in the neighborhoods, right? And so we're talking about vacant lots in the sense that, hey, we want these to be viable for private builders to build on and generate return, which is good. But the other benefit that that has, that I think is often maybe not appropriately highlighted in conversations of gentrification, is that for decades, most of the owners in these neighborhoods have not been able to realize equity in their homes in many cases. So in a lot of cases, people bought houses in Muskegon in the 80s and 90s for $40,000 or $50,000, and until the last decade, arguably, they were worth $40,000 or $50,000. And so one of the benefits to this redevelopment that is in the owner-occupied space, where people who have been historically quite frankly discriminated against in many cases through institutional barriers in real estate and finance, are starting to realize equity that they should have had a long time ago. And I firmly believe that our infill housing program, in particular the brownfield, is assisting neighborhoods in reaching market capitalization. And I think it's borne out. So interesting statistics that are related to that. Over the last 5 years, the city of Muskegon, either through private lot sales to partner builders who build their own house or through our own contracted builds, we account for 40% of all new construction single or small format multifamily. And that's very helpful. And when you start to look at the data, you'll find that virtually every home that was marketed under $300,000 in the last 5 years was one of our builds, either through one of those building partners or something we directly contracted. So you can make the argument that the only market that would have been in new construction space in Muskegon in the last 5 years would have been high-end market rate were it not for our infill housing. And I think that's important. I do have deep concerns about the single-family rental market in our neighborhoods, and I think that's where you see economic gentrification taking place now, tonight, while we're talking. And I think to Mr. Pesch's standpoint, we have a supply and demand issue. We have an environment of scarcity, which is creating a price pressure. And so the only thing we can do is create housing in those spaces to increase demand and eliminate scarcity, while continuing to utilize our brownfield to construct housing that is basically made artificially affordable through market manipulation with the brownfield TIF. So.
And I asked the question about the incentives because whether it's been private or public development, most of the recent residential development has been incentivized by the city, financially incentivized. Whether it's been through an NEZ or
That's a good.
Well,
and that's a well made point, and I would argue that even the ones that we are privately selling lots in exchange for them building houses, and we have deed security with reverter language and stuff, we incentivize those through very low market rates for our lot acquisition. We assist with connection fees, things like that. So we find ways to make this marketable. And I use this example often. I've used it in community meetings. We have examples where a building partner has built a house here and sold it at a market rate of $280,000, which to many of our residents, they're like, that is prohibitively expensive. That's a very expensive house. They've built the exact same model in neighboring communities that share a boundary with us, and in some cases are less than 5 miles from the house they built, and they sell for $430,000. So I think the relative affordability of even our market rate stock is maybe not well understood yet, because our market has been so historically undervalued. That's a good point. Yeah.
I just wanted to add a little comment. We mentioned earlier just the fact that Muskegon, we are an urban community, and I think that we have a variety of types of neighborhoods. There's a place for everyone here, but we have to remember that we are the core of the county. We are an urban community, and so even though we have some areas who have benefited from some of those downtimes and have double lots or have wider spaces, we have to start with understanding that we have to fill those gaps, and it's incumbent on us to consider the community good and just to do that collaboratively and help folks understand that we are an urban community, and so we have to focus on increasing that density, and so I think that we can do that.
did you have something to
I'm good right now.
add or ask?
No, I think most everything I was going to add or ask has been done.
Okay. So I do have some questions that have percolated throughout this time. So with regard to alleys, your recommendation for amending R1 to allow up to 4 units, will that have the same restriction that as in the form-based code, where if you were trying to do a triplex or quadplex, you have to be only rear-loaded alleyway? So that is going to be, that would be a requirement in your recommendation?
Yes, that would be our recommendation, would be that anything over a duplex requires alley-loaded parking.
Okay. Speaking of the parking situation, so I definitely agree that it needs to be reduced to some extent. I'm not so sure that it needs to be eliminated entirely. Maybe there are select areas or of the city that is appropriate, and other areas that's not appropriate. I know we have done that with the form-based code already downtown and in some of our neighborhoods, and we haven't. The market dictates what's developed, and so the houses, units coming online still have off-street parking because that's what is desired. My concern with a kind of one-size-fits-all, like, okay, eliminating parking across the entire city, is that there are certain sections of our city that it is not so conducive to have no on-street parking, or trying to push all parking onto the street for a number of different reasons. You know, one of which, maybe there's an area where there's a lot of the street grid where it's only parking on one side and not available on both sides, or like Campbell Field and other neighborhoods where the mailboxes are all on the street. It's not at the door. And so if you're pushing all the people to park there, are you going to then have interferences with, you know, getting your mail delivered or retrieving it, or same thing with the winter parking rules that were talked about, having the people move back and forth. So I just want us to, you know, be mindful of all these different things as we're moving forward, and whether or not it is sensible to have a one-size-fits-all with regard to if we were to eliminate or reduce. You know, certain sections might be appropriate to reduce and other sections to eliminate. Something that came to mind too about this is you mentioned earlier about how the higher density housing tended into being for lower income, or that's what, and so we saw this inequality or inequity developing, where if you've got the means, you're going to have single family, you're going to have, you know, a large lot. If you don't, you're going to be pushed into higher density, and so could we then see that develop with this parking situation as well, where, you know, if a developer does not have to provide parking and they go for the lower cost option of no parking, and it's like, oh, you can just park on the street, those then end being lower cost and then become something that people with lesser means are kind of forced to. Well, like, I can't afford to, you know, this higher income or higher cost housing that does have parking. I have to choose this. So I'm just, right now, I am just stream of consciousness right this moment. I would like to see the presentation or receive the presentation, as Commissioner Kilgo said, so that I can review that further. I would also like more contextual data with regard to Minneapolis. You know, we're looking at Minneapolis, and we saw what changed in terms of their zoning and to allow more housing options and density, which has helped alleviate the rising pressure on rental rates. What I would be also interested in is, so we got change in housing units. This is all housing units, right? Rental and non-rental, was it all housing units, that number? Okay. Mm-hmm. And then we got change in average rent, change in homelessness. So I guess I'd be interested in is how has housing values also changed over that time relative to the state and to the nation, but and the change in number of owner occupied, if there's any way to get that. I'm just curious, like, did we see a lot more rentals come online and owner occupied reduced? Sure. I mean, I'm just trying to understand the scope of how the implications of these zoning changes.
Yeah, I'd certainly see what I can pull together from ACS data. I will say that, and the link is live in the presentation, so when we send it, you'll be able to click that and
dig into it.
Yeah, but that's one analysis article from Pew, which is very good. Minneapolis was already a majority renter community, and so that was where their primary concern was, is that they saw people effectively feeling price pressure and being displaced, which is one of the reasons we chose this community as a case study is because we see that happening in our neighborhoods as well. And
It's the rising rents that
and
are
we're-
displacing people.
And we're
more so
also
than
a
rising
majority
property
renter
values.
community, according to the most recent data, and so there is parity there. I mean, we're closer to 50-50. They were a little bit more, to one side or the other. But yeah, absolutely, we'll pull together what data we can find from appreciation and values. Anecdotally, I'm quite confident that their values increased substantially as well, only because of the increase in population that they've seen, pretty substantial. So, and I think that speaks to the relevance of the case study, considering the fact they saw population growth and they still saw slower rent rate growth than the remainder of the states the state who didn't necessarily plan for housing infill.
So with regard to allowing single-family houses to be converted to multi-unit within the form-based code, how does it interplay with the historic district? So if a unit was in a historic district, would it need to get approval from the historic district commission before it could be, carved up and turned into multi-unit, or it would be able to do that just because the zoning allows it?
So the Historic District Commission oversees nothing in terms of use. If a business wants to locate in a building within a historic district, the Historic District Commission doesn't review what happens inside the building. It also would not review any changes that happen to the interior of the building unless in some way it affected the exterior of the building.
Okay.
So
So as
if-
long as the facade
Right.
aligned with the
Right.
appropriate historic
if
features.
you're not walling off a window on the inside, or if adding a unit would mandate the need for a fire escape staircase that is on the outside of the building. Those are the types of things that the HDC would review. But in terms of just the changes on the interior, they have no oversight over that. It's all exterior.
Okay. What happens with RT, two-family, and RM multifamily? So we talked about potentially getting rid of R1 or R2 and R3 and move everything to R1, or this new classification for the, collectively R1, R2, and 3. But what happens with RT, two-family, and then the RM multi-unit zoning?
Yeah, I think we've looked at it a few times, specifically with Nelson and the form-based code. Typically in those areas, we find what serves as the best fit for those. If RT, which is on a very, very small number of lots throughout the city at this point, if the recommendations were adopted, the RT zone would probably just be converted into what would amount to be the R1 zone with allowances for duplexes. It really is only in a handful of areas, and typically it's not utilized for that purpose. We've actually had people, and it's legal currently to build a single-family house in a RT duplex zone. So we're not seeing a ton of benefit to keeping it around with that. For our RM zones, RM1, RM2, RM3, we would likely down the road look toward what makes the most sense for maybe a form-based code context area, because the densities that are permitted in those multifamily zones currently are more in line with what you see in the form-based code. Though we would continue to look at maybe a potential merger of those two, lighter on the form-based parts of the regulations and a little bit more focused on the allowable number of units and just keeping the form-based parts that relate to how those buildings fit into their neighborhoods.
Okay. With regard to, you clarified in terms of the lot coverage, that if the changes for R2 and R3 and R1, this new classification, you could end up having 70% for building coverage and 20% for, I forget the wording you used, was it concrete, what was it?
Pavement coverage.
Pavement coverage. Potentially 70% for building, 20% pavement coverage, which then would bring 90% coverage altogether. I don't know any other way to
I think it'd be
say this. That makes me a little leery, potentially allowing 90% coverage, across the city with all of the residential zoning. It just gives me pause, and I need to reflect on the digest and understand the implications of that. And is that appropriate to have potentially 90%? I mean, obviously, we're not going to see that, just magically happen, but it would allow that. And is that something that we wish to see, or welcome, that we potentially have 90% lot coverage?
I think reviewing some real-life examples will help. A lot of charts, a lot of top-down view in this presentation, but I think on the ground examples would be the best way to depict what that looks like. It might be prevalent in a lot of neighborhoods already. It might not be. Again, just as arbitrary as parking requirements, the 70% was a number we felt would accommodate what a typical house might run into in terms of lot coverage. We didn't want to keep it when we created the R2 and R3 zones. We didn't want to keep it with the R1 requirements because you'd essentially be saying an R1 lot can be, 10,000 square feet in area, and an R3 can be 3,000, but you both get the same lot coverage, which didn't seem totally fair, and it didn't seem to translate down with the different sizes of lots.
To point out, one thing we've been considering is like a sliding scale zoning, which you can see in other communities. And like Jamie said, once we created the R3, some of those lots are so small, so 50%, we knew that we were going to have some problems redeveloping those. But maybe the sliding scale could be, if your lot is 3,000 feet, you can cover up to 70%. What we don't want is an 8,000 square foot R1 lot to be 70% covered. That would be very large. So
Yeah.
maybe 4,000 square foot, you get 60%, and then 50, it's your 5,000 or 6,000 square feet, it's your traditional 50%. So some type of sliding scale we could work on.
Okay. Yeah, I think that may be appropriate, not only from the perspective of accommodating green spaces within our residential areas, but impact on stormwater runoff and sewers. Like, the storm, if 90% impermeable surfaces and all the water is not being absorbed by the earth anymore, instead going through our stormwater system, what are the implications there? And does our infrastructure accommodate that? Or, okay. So of your four recommendations, I'm just going to share my thoughts for what they're worth at this moment. They certainly can evolve, over time, particularly as we are engaging with the community and hearing from property owners, hearing from residents, hearing from property managers and the like, that with regard to recommendation 4, reducing or eliminating on off-street parking, certainly support a reduction, and maybe it is appropriate to eliminate in certain areas. And maybe I can become of the mind that it's appropriate to eliminate it, citywide. Allowing single-family houses to be converted to multi-unit within the form-based district, I think that is appropriate. So basically what you're saying with that is, if you could construct a new building on this lot and it could be multi-unit, and you just happen to have an existing building in the same lot, you can now convert that. Yes. Yeah, which seems sensible to me, and an easy way to potentially create more housing options.
And potentially allowing it outside of the form-based code too. If we're going to be allowing duplexes outside the form-based code, coming up with some design regulations that would make that okay in those zones as well.
Yeah. Okay. And I do like the idea of allowing more multi-unit, like duplexes, and perhaps the triplex and quadplexes with the off-street or rear loading from the alleyway. Duplexes is potentially an easy way to add more density or more numbers. And ADUs, I like that. Being able to add more ADUs. I'm not so certain about recommendation 1, but I don't know. Like, in terms of getting rid of them all and just doing one, I'm not necessarily sold on the one size fits all. That's what I mean. And there's this one perspective, like, well, it's equal and it's consistent across the city, but equality does not necessarily mean equity at the same time, or equitable. And is it appropriate to have one size fits all, the exact same across the entirety of the city, when different portions of our city have developed over time differently, have different fabrics, of the neighborhood? And so is it really appropriate to have the exact same across the entire? I don't know. I mean, something that certainly need to reflect on, and also look at more of the examples, like you said, specifically with regard to the just more examples, and seeing real world examples of it. But I don't know about consolidating all of them to one and citywide. But I'm certainly open to the process, and what I'll say is that I really appreciate staff working on this. I really appreciate, because this is all hands on deck on how we navigate this housing crisis situation. And we've done superb work over the years, providing incentives. We've done superb work in terms of trying to attract investments for housing variety at all price points. Been very intentional and successful in attracting low-income housing tax credit developers, and working with developers to have mixed use or variety of use where they may have vouchers as well as market rate, or market rate as well as low-income housing tax to provide that diversity of housing options. So the city has done superb work over the years in trying to provide more housing options, and this is a continuation of that work, of you all looking at how can we make changes to the zoning to allow more housing variety options, flexibility, and support that breadth of quality housing at all price points to help mitigate the worst impacts of gentrification. And the worst impacts of gentrification is displacement. And we do not want to see our residents unnecessarily or unfairly displaced. And if we can make policies to help allow them to stay or otherwise age in place, as we've talked about, providing different housing options to stay in their community and move from one place to another, all the better. So really appreciate all the work that you all have done on this. And you all will be going to NAM. You'll be taking it on the road. We'll be hearing from our community. They're going to be, sharing concerns that none of us have thought about or asked about tonight. And so I just want to encourage staff to be receptive, and I'm sure you will. But be receptive to those concerns and those questions, and not just receptive to that, but receptive to potentially modifying or tweaking or evolving your policy recommendations to the Planning Commission, to the City Commission, based upon that feedback that you received from our community. Yeah, that's basically it.
Thank you. We'll get the presentation out to everybody, so please think of some questions and get with your constituents and get ready for the public input meetings, and feel free to share some of those concerns beforehand so we can work on addressing them. And, this was our recommendation to try to meet this housing goal. So it was all hands on deck and all ideas to meet that. And whether or not the community is 100% receptive to everything, I'm not sure that counting on that. So I think, we're going to keep an open mind and be flexible on this.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. Some good options and good work. Thank you. Any other? Commissioner Kilgo.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one thing. So the G word has come up a couple of times this evening, and it's almost a double-edged sword. And I know as you guys face public comment, and as we hear from constituents in the community, I just wanted to read the definition of gentrification. Gentrification is the process of making something more refined or respectable. But it also goes on to say the process whereby the character of a poor urban area is changed by whether people moving in, improving housing, and attracting new business, typically displacing current residents in the process. For you all to, as we receive public comment on this, us shining a light on the fact that we're talking about building on vacant lots currently. We're not talking about, hey, this zoning change, you have to get out your house so we can change this to conform to something. That if there's nothing right now in certain areas, there would stay nothing. Because it may be private land that somebody doesn't want to sell. They have a big yard, they want to keep a big yard because their kids are still little or something. So this isn't saying that every lot in the city is going to be split up. They're all going to go down to 30 feet and we're going to have tiny houses all over the place. Someone may say, I want to buy 2 lots and I want to build an 8,000 foot square house. It's every single house that's in the city of Muskegon right now is still going to be there and it's not going anywhere. And I just wanted to thank you gentlemen and your whole team for putting this together. Just as reading through it and listening to all the different comments, this will help our housing crisis, the housing need that we have. We're doing an excellent job of building that affordable housing. The one last thing I'll say, which I've said probably all three of you all, is let's make sure that we have resources to educate our citizens on how they can get into some of this new housing. We have some houses coming up in the infill project that are really, really affordable, but we have to be making sure we're teaching the citizens how they can buy it. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Coco. Mr. Manager, you had something?
Not sure if I've got my manager hat on or my commissioner,
planning
my
commissioner.
planner commissioner hat on here, but the point that Commissioner Kilgo just made, I think, is a really important one for us as staff. So I'm guessing more as the manager here now, that we're talking about minimums, not maximums, and that people can combine lots and things like that. That might not necessarily be always the ideal that we're looking for, but it's not saying you can't have a lot bigger than the proposals that we're putting forward. And I think sometimes when we have these conversations, that detail might get lost in those conversations. So just making sure that we're making that be known, because and obviously we work in this stuff all the time, and I had been thinking about it, but then when Commissioner Kogo said it, I was like, no, we have to make sure that that point is being driven home. So.
Commissioner Manager / Planning Commissioner. Any other final thoughts or questions? All right, when do you anticipate this will come to NAM? That's your starting point, launching point. Beyond this is going to NAM first. When do you anticipate going to NAM?
Well, we wanted to do that first, so I believe July NAM, and then we would hopefully still have a date reserved with the communications department on a July meeting. I think they might still have some openings in July, but that could be pushed out to August, but I hope not. I think we can still figure that out tomorrow and try to get a July date.
So NAM will be meeting in July. It was the last meeting, and they said that they will be meeting in July, so it's the first Wednesday in July. But they did acknowledge that it being right after, I think it's right after or right before 4th of July. Right before. They did acknowledge that, some of the members may not be present, neighbors may not be present, but they still thought it was valuable to meet. And so I just wanted to share that you might not get a full, get all of our neighborhoods there. And if you do proceed with presenting at the July NAM, please share the presentation by email as well with the different neighborhoods, and give them the opportunity to engage virtually or otherwise, make arrangements to confer with you all.
Yeah, we can do that.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Next item, complete streets policy.
Maybe I'll set mine up here. Balance.
Good evening.
So,
when you're ready, if you care to introduce yourself, please.
Sure, I'm Leanne Mikesell. I'm the Deputy City Manager. So I'm here tonight to talk to you about our proposed complete streets policy. It's nice to see our planning commissioners as well. So the policy was in the packet, so hopefully you've had a chance to read through it. I just really want to highlight a few things. Just to start out, what complete streets means is designing, building, and operating streets to routinely accommodate safe travel by all modes and all people. Making me nervous, Anne. You giving me 3 minutes?
Making me nervous too. I'm trying.
Guess that will be a good goal for me. So the idea is that streets, and just to understand, streets without safe access for non-motorized transportation will represent a barrier for people who use wheelchairs, for older adults, and for children. Pointing out some benefits of complete streets, they help address a wide variety of challenges, including pollution, climate change, traffic congestion, social isolation, obesity, and physical inactivity. They also help create walkable and vibrant communities which attract and retain businesses and residents. So the policy includes some goals. We would like to increase safety and walkability on all of Muskegon streets. We want to use design methods that promote the safe use of the right-of-way for all modes of transportation. We We want to enable healthier lifestyle choices by providing an expanding variety of safer and convenient walking and bicycling options. We want to promote a complete streets culture in Muskegon so that we can educate and provide events for people to really understand this better. We want to encourage private sector economic development that will benefit from and contribute to a more livable and vibrant community. We want to expand the network of safe walking and bicycle routes to schools, beaches, parks, and other community destinations. We want to connect with other groups in Muskegon that have goals related to complete streets. And we want to help address a wide variety of challenges that I listed just a moment ago: pollution, climate change, obesity, physical inactivity. So in order to do this, we have some operational guidelines. The first one is commitment. So understanding that complete streets will be integral to everyday transportation. I want to highlight some of the design considerations. Design and construction of new facilities should anticipate likely future demand for transit, bicycling, and walking facilities, and not preclude the provision of future improvements. We want to address the need for bicyclists and pedestrians to cross corridors as well as travel along them. The policy also includes a list of resource documents, standards, and guidelines that we can use. The policy also allows for exceptions, but I just want to point out in the exceptions that there's a high standard, so that, exceptions should be very rare. In talking about the jurisdiction of this policy, it would apply to all city-owned streets. We also want it to apply to all new private development projects, because we know a lot of those private streets end up becoming public streets. And it also allows for some consistency and expectation for anybody who's traveling within our city. Keep in mind that we do have some state-owned roads in our city, and so those are under the jurisdiction of the Michigan Department of Transportation. They also have a complete streets policy. So, there are some places that I can point out where we are working with MDOT, specifically on Apple Avenue, which is M46. Also, this policy would encourage us to coordinate with utilities. We know that utilities do work within our community, and sometimes the work that they do impacts our streets and transportation facilities. The overall goal of this approach is to preserve and enhance scenic, aesthetic, historical, and environmental resources while improving and maintaining safety, mobility, and infrastructure condition. There is a planning component with this. We will certainly be working with the Planning Commission. We need to make sure that the complete streets policy works with our master plan, our zoning regulations, subdivision regulations, and all other relevant planning and regulatory documents. So if this policy is adopted, there will be work for us to do together. I also wanted to point out that the policy includes a provision that I will give you an annual report on a number of performance measures. So the policy lists some measures. I certainly welcome input on other things that have come up for you that you think might be good to track. Just to list those out so people are aware of them. Rates of crashes, injuries, and fatalities by mode, meaning the method of transportation. Percentage of transit stops accessible via sidewalks and accessible ramps. Number of approved and denied exceptions. Completion of safe routes to school projects. Total miles of on-street bicycle lanes. Total miles of off-street bicycle facilities. Bicycle and pedestrian counts. Number and type of traffic calming measures that we have implemented. Congestion studies, and other things that come up that we think would be beneficial to track. So in implementing this policy, like I said, there will be some additional work to do. I will be the person that will oversee the implementation of it. We'll need to work with the planning director and the planning commission to review any land use ordinances and policies that would need to be modified to incorporate complete streets. Certainly we'll be working with the Public Works and Engineering departments. We're already doing this to establish some necessary procedures and work on design standards for our streets. Different types of streets will have different standards. We certainly will be encouraging staff to get professional development so that they can educate themselves on complete streets. And then, of course, we will need the City Commission to support us in promoting this endeavor and educating the public.
Excellent.
Questions for me?
So first of all, I'll start off by saying thank you.
You're
At the
welcome.
beginning of this year, I think it came up about complete streets. It was mentioned that we have a policy, the commission took an action to support complete streets, but it wasn't exactly fleshed out
Right.
in policy format or a consistent understanding of what does complete streets mean and what does that all entail and how is it implemented. And so I think you've done a great job with drafting this policy and helping to understand how it operates, how it's going to be implemented, and when there may be exceptions. So excellent work. The only caveat that I can think of right this moment, and it's very minor, is just that, and I understand you're leading this and you'll be implementing it and monitoring and updating us, but I'm just wondering if I would say, convey, I would prefer instead of using the deputy city manager in there, just say city manager's office. I told you it's very minor. Like I understand it's you and the city manager is going to have you in here in this case, but if we have a policy here, it's coming out of the city manager's office, and so it's I told you it's just
Sure.
it's just a matter of semantics to some extent. Like it might not be the deputy city manager in the future who's doing it, so just saying the city manager's office.
Sure.
But that's it for me. So I'm going to. Oh, did you have? I thought I heard
there
you
was
say
one other
something.
thing I wanted to point out, and that is, I believe all of you get this magazine, and I don't know, nobody conferred with me, but somehow they timed this really well because there's an article in here about complete streets. So there is some additional information that you can review in this magazine. All of this supports everything that's in our policy. I also wanted to point out that I've been working on this since probably before COVID. So, it's one of those things that we work on and then it gets dropped because other things are happening, and it's gone through a number of DPW directors.
Well, thank you for picking it back up and keeping it in progress. And now to the point of potential adoption by the City Commission tomorrow.
That would be awesome.
One other thing before I go to anyone's questions or comments is just something to put on your radar as this is moving forward, being implemented. The public transit piece of it, obviously, Matt's and public transit is a little bit in flux, is like what the future entails in our community. But last I'd heard is that Mass did have a number of like sheltered bus coverings in storage.
They do.
And so being mindful of where can we put those to support public transit in our city. And again, Matt's and public transit's in flux, but just on our radar, like, hey, if they're available and we can help facilitate getting them installed along the routes, let's do that as part of the implementation of the complete street policy.
Just to let you know, we were looking at a potential grant opportunity and have been working with Matt's to look at the most popular or highest served, highest used routes and stops, and what are the sidewalk connections in those areas? What does the adjacent property look like? Would there be a place for a bench or a shelter? So we've actually done some of that legwork. So as funding becomes available, I think it will be easier for us to implement that.
Excellent. So I'm going to go to the Planning Commission first on this and then go to the City Commission. So I'm going to open up to the Planning Commission with your questions and your thoughts.
Just a couple quick comments. So one thing I've noticed in the core of Muskegon is that the street is a social space. And it's not just walking down the sidewalk, walking your dog, saying hi to your neighbor, but the actual street is a social space. And so it's something to just keep in mind as we develop these, how we can consider that and encourage folks to use better means, but also not to deflect them from engaging, with their neighborhood the way that they currently do. And as we densify our housing and focus on our streets, we have to focus on the green space, and we have to be very intentional about that, because as we get more dense, it's going to have a lot more concrete, and we're going to lose a lot of trees. So wherever we can incorporate trees in the complete streets would be great. Did we previously have complete streets efforts? Because I feel like it's in my brain and then it just kind of went away.
So, interestingly here, this is a resolution to support complete streets, which had been adopted in 2013, and the motion was made by you.
That's fine. Okay. I was like, I've
You
heard
were
this before.
Commissioner Markowski at the time, City Commissioner Markowski, but it was actually you had made the motion to adopt the resolution of support for complete streets.
Got it. And then just lastly, if we've got a covered bus station, it should go on Laketon.
Thank you.
I was just gonna say it's about time. The resolution was passed a long time ago, and it was actually part of a public health project, and supported by the state, of course. And doing the walkthrough with Dan Burns, I don't even remember what his name was. That whole big project where we walked around downtown and looked at the good things, the bad things, talked about complete streets. So, yay! Finally, I can finally really retire, because I've been trying to get this through forever. So, congratulations.
Any other thoughts or questions from the Planning Commission? No? Okay. Commissioners. Commissioner Kilgo.
Thank you. So the summary of, well, first of all, Deputy Manager, thank you for putting this together, and it sounds like it's been a really long time. And it's, reading through it, I just had a lot of questions, and then hearing you talk about it today, I still have some questions, mainly around, so the summary is to, part of the summary is to reduce vehicle miles traveled on our streets by walking, bicycling, and public transportation. So you've had conversations with our public transportation now. Are we looking to expand the system, buses, more vans? Because I hear that a lot of people are using the van service now and not necessarily as many people using the bus system. So I am curious about like those numbers of what they do now and how we're actually going to promote more walking, bicycling, and public transportation. And then is this Complete Streets project talking about things like redoing streets specifically for the Complete Streets project, or streets that need to be done for other things? Then we look to add bike lanes or add accessibility for pedestrians or walking or bicycling, stuff like that. I'll start with those two because I know I'm asking a bunch of questions. I'll start with those two.
Thank you. My memory doesn't hold a lot all the time, so I appreciate you breaking this up for me. As far as transit, we're working with MATS. I'm part of the group that is looking at the Regional Transit Authority. So there was a study done not all that long ago to really understand how people are using MATS, and some changes were made. I know that there is a desire to expand service. The thing is that comes with a great cost. And so if we are going to expand services for transit, we have to probably find a different funding model. So that's something that's in process. The Complete Streets policy is really more of a higher level overarching view. And so it's not saying you should do this on this street or you should do that on that street. It's saying when you are looking at what a street does, you should be making sure that it accommodates the uses that everybody needs for that area. It doesn't mean that every street's going to have transit stops and every street's going to have bike lanes and every street's going to have sidewalks and, and boulevards or whatever it is. It's saying look at the context of that area and design the street appropriately, making sure that you're accommodating everybody who needs to travel, and even if that is crossing. So what will come are street standards that won't be part of the complete streets policy, that those will be separate street standards that we put together for different context areas. So obviously, a neighborhood residential street is going to look very different from a commercial district street. Does that help?
It does help.
Great.
Thank you.
Oh, you asked me about when we would do things. It's a little bit yes and, but it's mostly as we receive funding. Perhaps maybe we've decided that there's a potential route for a bike path like we did for Terrace. So we're seeking funding for that, so that will be built when we have the funding. Most of the time it will be a matter of, okay, we've targeted this section of roadway because of its condition, our asset management plan, this is where it fits. And so then we'll look at, all right, who's using this? How are people getting through and across? And then we'll decide how that design gets incorporated.
Awesome. So you kind of answered my last question, which is price points. There's no set number because this is not saying we have to do this on every street or we have to budget for this. We're going to look at projects kind of by a case basis, see how we can improve certain roads or areas.
That's correct.
With this project. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Commissioner Hugo? Commissioner Cochin?
Thank you very much. I appreciate you taking the time to do all of this. It's going to be a very interesting project, I can already tell. I do have a couple of questions. One, I kind of wanted to piggyback off of Jay's while it's still fresh in your mind. You were discussing budget. And where would that fall within the budget? Would that go into the 2025 year then? Or is there not going to be a set budget for it and it'll just come out of the general fund?
There isn't a set budget for this policy. What will happen is when a section of roadway is planned, like if you look at our capital plan and, Southern is going to be done in the near future, right? So when we know that we're designing for Southern, one of the first steps will be to understand who's using it and how are they using it, what do we need to accommodate. So it will be part of the budget for that street project.
Okay, all right.
Unless we get grant funding.
Okay. And then I wanted to ask, so you listed traffic calming measures. Can you elaborate for the folks at home? Like, what exactly is a traffic calming measure?
There are lots of things. Street trees can be traffic calming, on-street parking, bike facilities, narrower lanes, bump outs at intersections, even mid-block pedestrian crossings can calm traffic if you do them in certain ways. You can kind of raise the crossing, or a lot of times we even put a sign out that says to yield to pedestrians.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of different things can be traffic calming.
Okay. And then I did get an email about this, so I want to ask, and you kind of touched base on it, because Shoreline is an MDOT road.
Correct.
And the streets initiative that we're talking about tonight is not the Shoreline Road Diet, correct?
That's correct. This is an overarching policy for city streets. It mentions MDOT streets because we have MDOT roads within the city, but just like we've said before, we can only do what MDOT will allow us to do.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make sure that people who might be at home wondering that, they can hear that and know that this is not that.
Yep, that would be a legitimate question. I totally agree.
And then I guess the last thing is, how do you see this positively impacting our city in like a real quick little snippet?
It really makes us a more livable, I would say, city. It it tends to go along with placemaking, if you've heard that term before. You know, if you look at Western Avenue, for instance, and if you look at that article that I mentioned, they talk about a street where they had the bollards that could be moved back and forth. So that's one of the things that comes from complete streets, because you're looking at what is the use of that right of way. And, you know, and we found a way to make it flexible. So it can be gathering space, as Leah was pointing out, that, you know, sometimes our streets are gathering spaces. So it's things like that. And it ends up encouraging people to be out and interacting with each other and visiting our businesses instead of just getting in their car and driving by.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Anything to add or ask right now, Vice Mayor St. Clair? Anything, Commissioner Gorman? No? Mr. Manager / Planning Commissioner?
Nope, good.
All right.
Thank you.
Thank you. This will be on the City Commission's general, or not, yeah, on our consent agenda for our general session meeting tomorrow. So, we'll be going to public comment. Folks can call in. First, I'm going to go to anyone in the audience. I do not have any forms to speak for public comment, but get ready at home if you do wish to phone in your public comment. That phone number is 231-724-6721. First, I'm going to open up to the audience. Would you like to address the commission? Okay, you don't have to. You're our only remaining member of the public in the audience, so sorry to put you on the spot.
Thank you for allowing me to listen and learn.
Absolutely. Thanks for being here tonight. All right, we're going to the phones. So if you wish to give public comment, you have up to 3 minutes. When you call, please turn down any audio in the background. And when you're called upon, please provide your name and which neighborhood you live in, if you are a city resident, and if you're not a city resident, which city, town, or village you may be calling from. You might have echo.
Yeah.
Some echo issues. All right, no phone calls?
No, Mayor.
Then I would entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Support.
All right, we have a motion by Commissioner Cochin, supported by Commissioner Kilgo to adjourn. All in favor, please indicate by saying aye.
Aye.
Aye. All opposed, same sign. We are adjourned. Thank you. Take care and be well, all.